Hello again. This is Dr. Robert Guthrie, and we're continuing our Bible study Sunday school lesson from the Jerome United Methodist Church here in Dublin, Ohio. We're covering the Gospel of Matthew right now. We're covering Matthew's Gospel in 4 parts. This is the 3rd part, which will be covering chapters 15 through 21. So this covers the latter part of Jesus' ministry, and it goes up until his entry into Jerusalem and what became Palm Sunday, as part of the Passion Resurrection sequence, which will be the next week's lesson. We'll start off with one of his several times he's challenged by the Pharisees. Remember, the Pharisees are very threatened by Jesus coming, and as our religious leaders currently would be very threatened if he shows up. And they're always looking for ways to critique him, and they were not an official trained or ordained kind of group. The Pharisees were kind of like being an evangelical in modern terms. It's an unofficial community-based group who have taken upon themselves, than the Pharisees in the New Testament, to maintain the purity of the law, enforce discipline on people and things like that. So they challenged Jesus on his disciples aren't doing hand washing. Hand washing is part of the ritual before you eat, which is actually a good thing to do. But I think the real lesson here is that if you have a legalistic approach to your religion, you can get to where you're worshiping the law, not the Lord, worshiping the rules, worshiping the ritual rather than the Lord. And Jesus is trying to say, you're not going to contaminate yourself by what you take into the body. What goes into the body goes into the stomach, down through the sewer. I love that term in the New Testament, because when we did gross anatomy my freshman year of medical school, we realized the intestinal system was really a sewer. So I particularly love that. He said, it's not what contaminates you. What contaminates you is what comes out of your mouth, coming from your heart. Hatred, vengeance, evil, greed, lust, those kinds of things. So, and it's an interesting challenge, because if you look at the Jewish religion at the time, and they're very ritualistically oriented, and they had these very strict dietary laws. You couldn't eat pork, you couldn't eat shellfish, and Jesus is saying, why are you worrying about this? What comes out of you is what's evil, not what goes in. So he's challenging a lot of these long-term, very severely maintained rules, which are actually still part of Judaism at this time. It's followed by a Canaanite woman coming and asking him to heal her child, and that it's an interesting, because she's a Gentile, not a Hebrew, and the Canaanites are actually the original enemies of the blood of the Hebrews. They were the original inhabitants of the Palestine, Israel, Judah area that were driven out after Joshua and the conquest had begun, and they ended up migrating up into what's now Lebanon. So here's a Gentile woman who's coming from the enemies of the blood, and Jesus heals her, no problem. And it's starting to show that the Jesus movement, the Christian faith, will extend beyond the Hebrew group, because it's a relatively small group, toward the whole world. It's one of several lessons to point that out. And then he has another feeding of the masses. Most people remember one. Most people forget that there's a second up on the mountain late in the afternoon. Nobody's food. He feeds the masses a second time. This is like 4,000, and they have a different number of fish and a different number of loaves of bread. Then the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now the Sadducees are a different group. They're an official group. They're a group of the wealthy elite in Jerusalem, and they have very conservative views. They only have the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They don't believe in the prophets. They don't believe in heaven or hell or afterlife. They have very conservative views, and they disappear after the Roman conquest in 70 AD. But they asked Jesus for a sign, as proof of who he is. And I'm certain he's thinking, what do I have to do? I heal the sick, I raise the dead, I calm the storm, I feed the multitude. What more do you want? He didn't say that, but I'm certain that's what he was thinking. And he says, forget it. It's interesting, because I think about this, and I think, what would happen to Jesus if he came back now? Same thing happened to him last time, probably. But our a lot of our current religious leaders who would be very threatened by this man appearing and saying the same things he said in the New Testament, but many people don't adhere to, like you can't love God and money, and career doesn't matter, and the family is the group of believers around you, not your relative kin, and career doesn't matter. All these things, they'd be demanding a sign of him too. These TV preachers and the people with the well-oiled machines where they raise all this money and they live on great comfort off of the money of the believer. So exactly the same thing will be happening to him right now. So, just file that one away. And, if you don't agree with me, that's fine. Send me an email and tell me I'm being too critical of them in their comfort and making a good living off of the church. Then he asked the 12 apostles, who do you think I am? Some of them say Elijah coming back. Some of them say John the Baptist. And Simon says, you're the Christ, the Messiah. And basically Jesus compliments him on his vision and understanding. He says that you will be preeminent among the apostles. I will give you the keys to the kingdom. Now, it's an interesting thing because if you see the seal of the Vatican and statues with Peter and things like that, they will have the keys of the kingdom in the hand. So they're continuing the tradition from Peter on down with the keys of the kingdom in their iconography that they have. So it's very interesting if you look at the seal, the symbol of the Vatican, you'll see the keys of the kingdom. And he gives him a new name. He says your name is now, it's Peter. Now it's got it in several different languages. In Aramaic, it's Cephas. So if you remember when Paul's letters we talked about, he was complaining about Peter. He was calling him Cephas, which is the Aramaic, means stone or rock. You could argue that Jesus was referring not just to Peter's character of being rock strong, but sometimes his head of being rock hard. And then it's Petros in Greek and Lapis, I think it is in Latin. But this was a unique name. Nobody was called this before at this time. So he gives him the new name. And they also give the apostles the power to forgive sins. This is a very tricky one, because if you look back at medieval Roman history, this was the power of absolution. It is not as an official power anymore. The church has modernized it, and they have a term, reconciliation is the current term, where you ask for forgiveness and do a penance if you need to. But in the old days, back in the medieval time, this gave enormous power to the priests and the bishop, because if you were convinced these things you had done were going to send you to hell, the only way you could avoid that was to have the priest, or particularly the bishop in a bad sin, like a murder or something, forgive you. So it gave the clergy enormous power. And the problem with too much power is, of course, it always corrupts. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So it was very, very tricky. And the church has moved away from it now. So they still want you to seek forgiveness. We all need to seek forgiveness. But they don't have the power of absolution where the priests get to decide your forgiveness. It's between you and God. And then they have the prophecy of the Passion, and he predicts to his followers, you're going to have to take up your cross and follow me and suffer for the faith. It's an interesting thing. We don't really, here in the U.S., we don't have situations where we're going to get killed for our faith, as you will in certain parts of the world, even at this time, or get thrown in jail like you will in certain parts of the world. So this is really an issue, but in my situation, it's been the more difficulties of that are what can happen in church. Church can be tricky. So I have a policy where I will not fight in church, and therefore I avoid a lot of the squabbles that go on. But that's really where a lot of times we have to bear our crosses is putting up with each other in church and remembering to love each other instead of struggle with each other. So that's a good point to remember and take that way. That's our crosses to bear. Then we have the Transfiguration. That's a very interesting account where he takes the two sets of brothers, Simon Peter and Andrew, James and John, up on a mountain. I've been on that mountain, and have the Transfiguration where Elijah and Moses appear. And these represent the continuity of the Yahweh faith, from Moses, the greatest of the early prophets, through Elijah, the greatest of the prophets of the kingdom time, when they had the independent kingdoms, down to Jesus. And the cloud comes down and God's voice speaks, "This is my beloved son." And then it all just changes. Jesus told them, "Keep it quiet. Don't talk about this until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." And then there's another healing episode of another epileptic where the apostles couldn't heal it, and Jesus can. And they said, "Why couldn't we do it?" And he said, "Oh, you don't have enough faith. If you had the faith the size of a mustard seed," well, mustard seed is a tiny little seed. If you had even that big, your faith was, you could have done this. I thought that's kind of a good challenge, because most of us having the faith of a mustard seed, that would be something that that's not much. And you think, wow, if I have that, then I can have all kinds of faith. So then the apostles ask him, when is Elijah going to come? Because Elijah was supposed to come and reappear as the symbol of the coming of the Messiah. And Jesus said, Elijah's already come. You all didn't recognize him. It was John the Baptist, of course. We now recognize him from our perspective that it was John the Baptist, was the Elijah, the voice in the wilderness. They didn't at the time, and some people did, but John knew what he was doing. But a lot of people didn't, and he ended up getting thrown in prison and executed by the king. Then there's an interesting story on the temple tax. They said, "How are you going to pay the tax?" And he tells Peter to go down to the ocean, throw in a line, they'll catch a fish, and there'll be a coin in the mouth, and that'll be the temple tax, which was half a penny, half a denarius on each person per year to support the temple. We don't pay taxes to support our temples anymore, but they have for a long time. America is different, that we put in religious freedom, but it means you are on your own church-wise, and so, which has been very healthy for the American churches not to have government support. And then one of the stranger stories, and the apostles are bickering over who's the greatest. And I thought, as I read this, because it's in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, I thought, why would you want to care? Who cares to be first of this group? They had church squabbles. Church squabbles, in my experience, are usually over nonsense. They're over personal egos and personal whims and personal preferences. So you had them even in the time of Jesus' apostles. Here they are bickering over who's going to be the first. And I thought, wouldn't mind being the last as long as I'm part of the group. So it's very interesting. You had church squabbles even there in the first century. Very interesting thing about welcoming the little children, which he has, and severe condemnations over those who will lead them astray. And that's a particular problem of recent Christianity, of people of the clergy, not just the Roman Catholic clergy with their pedophilia, but there's been a number of male Protestant clergies with heterosexual sexual abuse of young girls in the church. So it's a real issue. The clergy have a position of importance and prominence, almost dominance in certain communities. They can really succumb to human weaknesses and take advantage of situations like this. So there's severe condemnations on that. If you're going into the clergy, you got to be really careful of controlling your sins, because the clergy people are sinners just like the rest of us, and you've got to be very careful about that. And then a very interesting story on if you have 100 sheep and you lose one of them, you'll leave the 99 aside and go out and search for the lost one, and if you find it and bring it back, there'll be more rejoicing. So he's really trying to tell the Christians, don't be resentful over people coming late to the faith. Someone coming in late to the faith is just as great as someone having been all along. Rejoice at the new person. Don't be resentful of how they had this life of sin and then came to recognize their sinfulness. Say, that's great, that's wonderful, welcome aboard. Everybody's involved here. Then Peter asked him, following this, how many times do I have to forgive my brother? 7 times? And in this gospel, Jesus says, no, 77 times. In other gospels, he says 7 times 70 times. So, it's very easy to say and tough to do, but we got to be willing to forgive. And he's got a very interesting story about the unforgiving debtor of a very rich man has a servant who owes him an enormous amount of money. The footnotes in my Bible said the equivalent of $60 million. That's a lot of money. and the guy's going to sell him into slavery and to get some money, and the servant falls on his knees and pleads, forgive me, and blah, blah, blah. And he says, okay, he felt sorry for him. Then that person who was forgiven has somebody who owes him a couple $100, and he gets all hyped up, and he's going to sell that person and his wife and family into slavery for this small debt, and the master finds out and jumps him, gives severe punishment. So he's really trying to tell us, if we want God's forgiveness, we've got to be forgiving too, because other people are going to sin, and we've got to be in a situation where we share our love with all of them. He struggles with the question, or we struggle with his condemnation of divorce. Divorce was allowed under Mosaic law. It's actually allowed under almost all laws around the world. But Jesus condemns it. I think Jesus condemns it more to protect the women, because in Jewish law, the women were not really allowed to divorce the men as they were in Roman law. That really they were very dependent position, and the husbands divorced them for some younger woman. They had no way to make a living except prostitution. So I think Jesus was very clear to protect the women from abusive men. It's all changed in modern culture. It's very, very tricky. So I think he was doing it to protect the women, and the problem is when you have a no divorce in society, then people murder each other a lot more. People murder each other now still, but they murdered each other a lot more if that was the only way to get out of an unhappy marriage. So there's got to be some accommodation to this. I'm not in favor of divorce, but it has to be part of the society. It's just too difficult to force this on people. So, but it's very tricky now. Very interesting story about the rich young man. He's a good, law-abiding person, honoring his parents and all this, and he wants to follow Jesus. And Jesus says, "Sure, but go and sell all your property and give it to the poor, and then come and follow us." And the guy can't do it because he's very wealthy. It's a very interesting and an important analogy to us, because in this culture here in the U.S. with all our materialism, and around the world with all the materialism, the real competition to a life of faith is a life of material greed, avarice, loving of material property. It's the real challenge. There are other challenges that various other people have on their other behaviors, but that's really a challenge, and that's a tough one. And Jesus said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And they challenge him, and they said, well, what about these people? He says, well, this is the law, but with God, all things are possible. So you can make it, but what he says over and over again is you can't love God and money. It's interesting because with God, all things are possible is actually the motto of the state of Ohio. Here in Ohio, it became the motto about 1959 because they didn't have a motto. They had dropped their previous one. But that is the motto of the state, and it comes right out of Matthew. He makes the point, and in heaven the last will be first and the first will be last. Again, that's the same thing with the apostles about struggling to be first. And I just think, who cares? As long as you're part even the last one in and the least in heaven, be fine with me. But the lesson about that is the vineyard, where they hired a series of workmen to come in and work in a vineyard. And they come in about 9 o'clock in the morning, and they're going to be paid a standard day's wage, which was a denarius, a penny. And then he hired another group at noon and gave them the same offering. Hired another group mid-afternoon, another group late afternoon. And when it came to pay them, the owner of the vineyard was going to pay them all what they had agreed to, which is a denarius for everyone. And the people who were worked all day said, hey, this isn't fair. You're giving them the same reward when they only worked part of the day. And the point of it, and the master says, hey, you're getting exactly what you bargained for. So the point of this is we should not be resentful of people who come late to the faith. We should be thrilled that they come late to the faith. It's better to come late than not at all. So I think that's the lesson here for us, is to accept people even after they've had bad lives, because often when people leave such terrible lives that the only way they can get their act together is true religious conversion into the Christian faith, to get them forgiveness and get them to behave themselves. So it's a very, very interesting lesson, and very important for us that we welcome people whenever they come in. There's another prophecy of the Passion. The third one, then the mother of James and John comes and wants them to be given a preeminent place in heaven next to Jesus on his right and left hand. And I again think of this, why are you worrying about that? You know, if you're there. And Jesus says, can you drink my cup? It's interesting because they actually did drink his cup. They were both martyred in 44 BC in 44 AD, excuse me, for being followers of Jesus. So they actually did drink the cup, basically take up their cross and bear it. Then you have the two blind men at Jericho who he's coming by and he cried to him, Son of David, can you save us? And he doesn't like being called Son of David because the Davidic Messiah was going to be this warrior king, which Jesus was not. He had no intention of doing that. He was here to save the world, not to restore the kingdom of David. So he heals them, but he tells them to stop saying that. And of course, they keep doing it anyway. And this is on his way into Jerusalem, and he arrives and he has the entry. He sends people to get a colt, and those stories are minor differences. Sometimes it's two people going, sometimes it's one. Sometimes it's a young colt. Sometimes it's a regular donkey with a baby with it. The minor differences, and they put the robes on him, cut the palm fronds, and you have Palm Sunday, which is still one of our very important annual rituals that we all go through. We remember as kids walking down with the palm fronds, and now we have the kids do it with us. So then he goes and drives the money changers from the temple. And this is an important lesson because it's a good lesson for all of us in modern life also. The temple was the place everybody was supposed to come and worship whenever they could. You couldn't use the Roman money as a temple offering because it had a picture of Caesar on it. It had a graven image on it. So you had to change that to an acceptable temple treasury. And the people that ran that business, of course, took their cut. And the people who were in the temple got a cut of their cut. And you had to bring in sacrifice animals. Most people couldn't bring a dove or a lamb or anything because of the distance, or they didn't have it, so they could buy it there and have them sacrifice it. So everybody was having a nice business, and everybody was making money off it, including the priests. And Jesus comes in and said, you've turned this into a den of bandits, my Father's house, and he turns over the tables and drives them out. And this is what really sets them off, is when you get into somebody's business and pocketbook, then they get really defensive and really angry, and that really sets them off. They challenge him on his authority. You know, who gave you your authority? And he says, well, how about John the Baptist? What was his authority? Was his authority divine authority, or was his authority human authority? And they think to themselves, well, if we say it was divine authority, he's going to say to us, why didn't you believe him? Which they didn't. And if he says it's human authority, then the people are going to be mad at us and maybe riot because they thought John's authority was divine authority. So he says we don't know. And then he said, okay, well, if you're not going to answer that one, then I don't have to answer you. So that's an interesting way of getting out of this. And it's an interesting story about the two sons. This is not the prodigal son. They say a father has two sons. He tells them, go do this chore. Doesn't say what the chore is, of course. And the first one says, oh, no, I'm not going to do it. And then he repents and goes and does it. And the second one says, sure, I'll do it. Oh, yeah, and then never does anything. We all know people like that. And so who's favorite? Because obviously it's the first one who did it. And then you have the final parable, which is about the wicked tenants of a lord sets up a vineyard and leases it to tenants, and they owe him a certain amount of the crop, and he sends somebody to collect the crop, and they tell the guy to get lost and throw him out. He sends another person, and they beat him up and throw him out. A third person or so, they stone him, other things. He finally says, well, I'll send my son. They'll believe my son, and they'll respect him, and they think, hey, this is the son and the heir. Let's kill him, and we get everything. And so they kill him and force the master to come in and wipe him out. And I think then they kill the son, and he comes in and wipes them out and gives it to other tenants. And I think the lesson here is really toward the Pharisees, that Jesus came to save you. And if you're going to reject him, he can also come to save the whole world. And so the faith will move beyond the narrow, small group here in what's now considered the Holy Land, and it will go worldwide. Christianity is worldwide now. So the real lesson in here is don't reject him, because it's here for the whole world and will take the faith out to the whole world. And that's really what happened. So that's how I read this. And the Pharisees were very upset because they knew he was talking about them. That's the end of this chapter. I don't know whether I did it too quickly or not quickly enough, but there's a lot in here. But I think the real lesson of the evil tenants was, don't reject this guy and kill him, which is what they did, because this is the faith for the whole world, and it will move out and beyond you and not be your exclusive domain anymore. So it's Dr. Gunther. We'll stop here. We'll finish Matthew up next week, and then we'll proceed on. Thank you very much.